In this tutorial, I'm going to show you all the basics of building and painting scale models that I like to use, that I know will help you get some amazing looking aircraft. I'm that model making guy, and in this tutorial I'm going to be going through some of the scale modelling basics and skills that I've learnt to give you the confidence and knowledge to go away and build your own. You'll find all the brushes, paints and hobby supplies I use in this tutorial linked in the description below, and I'll put them on the screen as I use them. If you enjoy my content, please give this video a like and let me know in the comments below. It lets YouTube know you enjoyed my tutorial and they'll share my video out to more people. I've been building and painting models and miniatures for a long time now, and I'm making it my mission to help more people get started and involved in this amazing hobby that I love. If you're an absolute beginner, go check out my tutorial going through building and painting your first scale model to get you started. But if you're ready for the next step, let me show you some of the basics and techniques that I use to build and paint my models. The kit I'm going to be working on throughout this tutorial is going to be the AIRFIX 148 scale Mk.1 Supermarine Spitfire. I chose this scale because I wanted something more detailed to work on, but everything I'm going to show you can be applied to 172 or even 132 and higher. So which scale do you work with? It feels like a big decision. With the smaller 172 scale, there's more variety and choice in what you can buy, and they don't take up as much space either. With 148 or larger scale models, there's more detail which allows you to get more involved with the kit, and there's more opportunity to use more advanced skills and techniques. No matter the kit you do decide to build, the first thing we want to do is plan, so grab those instructions. The first thing you want to do is to spend some time going through the instructions. They can be quite detailed with lots of information and options. Take note of the options that are given to modify the kit. For example, you can cut away this panel to have an open cockpit door, or to have the gun bays open to show more detail. You'll also need to decide which variant of the kit to build, as there will be different parts used depending on your choice, and for our 148 scale Spitfire, I'll be building and painting Scheme A. And one of the last things I also find helps is to mark the different colours I need throughout the build and when they're needed. Just spending some time and going over the instructions like this really helps me feel prepared, and I also feel a lot better knowing that I'm going to have everything I need to get started. There is no substitute for learning the basics, and this includes knowing how to get your parts ready for building and painting. But before I even start to cut parts off the sprue, I like to give the sprues a clean in some warm soapy water. This removes any dirt and residue left over from when the sprues were made, which could cause problems for us. When you're ready to start, we can use a pair of clippers to remove the parts we want from the sprue. Make sure the flat side of the clippers is facing the part you want to cut away, and I recommend cutting a little distance away, because as we cut the plastic, it can bend and deform smaller parts if we're not careful. This also makes it easier to remove excess sprue we don't want from areas, rather than trying to get a closer cut whilst it's still attached. You'll see that where the parts were attached to the sprue, it doesn't look very good. These are easily cleaned up using a variety of different tools, like scraping tools, craft knives and files. However you decide to clean your parts, just make sure to be careful and take your time, because you don't want to start removing too much plastic or any of the details. So when it comes to getting all the parts cleaned up and ready for assembly, you can do this as and when you need them, or you could just get everything ready at the same time, which I actually like to do. If you choose to do this, then you just need to make sure you keep all the parts organised. I like to do it this way because I like to have the part ready when I need it for a better build flow. It also gives you a chance to prepare any parts that need modifying and organise parts for painting. For example, we need to modify the body half so the canopy can fit. I assume if this was a different version of the Spitfire, then we wouldn't have to do this. If you need to remove or cut away any of the plastic, I would first stick down the part with some blue tack, so we don't have to worry about it moving around or slipping. You'll also need a sharp hobby knife. Take your time and repeatedly score along where you need to cut. Eventually you'll cut through and you'll be able to remove the area we don't want. I also like to decide what parts I'm going to paint separately from the main assembly. I tend to leave a part of the sprue still attached where I know I'm not going to need to paint. This gives us something to grab onto rather than holding onto the part. You could even create sub-assemblies where we glue some of the smaller parts in place. I glue the parts in place with some poly cement, which welds the parts together, creating a much stronger bond than super glue. When you've decided what parts to leave separate, you can mount them to some cocktail sticks using some blue tack. I like to use cocktail sticks because you can push them into a sponge to keep everything organised. Understand that what I'm showing you and teaching you in this video is just how I like to go about building and painting my model kits, and there's actually a lot of different ways to go about doing it. At the end of the day, it's your hobby and you do what works best for you, regardless of the opinion of other people. So now we've planned and our parts are ready and organised, I think we're ready to get started. In this first section, we'll be going through getting the cockpit built and painted. This is usually done first because you won't be able to do this once the rest of the aircraft is built around it. So first of all, let's get all the parts and any sub-assemblies ready for painting, if you haven't already. I like to keep parts separate because it just makes painting them and all the details so much easier. I'm going to be showing you how to brush paint throughout this tutorial, which I personally like to do. But let's prime the surface first of all to give the paint something to adhere to. I'm using HUMBROL Grey Spray Primer, and I find it works best if it's at least room temperature and it's been given a good shake for a couple of minutes. You want to try and keep about 4 arms length away when spraying, and to make sure the paint doesn't build up in places, you want to use small bursts whilst keeping the spray moving. Make sure to let it dry before doing any painting. Throughout this tutorial, I'm mainly going to be using HUMBROL products, but if you prefer or want to use other products, then go for it. What's more important to me is showing you the techniques and teaching you the skills to go away and build your own model kits, and hopefully give you the confidence which is going to let you enjoy the hobby more. So when it comes to actually painting, we want to thin our paints first of all, and for this I just use some water, and I find using the same amount as you have paint works best. When it comes to actually applying the paint, we don't want an overloaded brush. This is why a palette comes in handy, so we can control how much paint we have. Let's start with some 78 cockpit green, and to make sure we get a nice smooth finish to our paint, you want to keep your brush moving and try not to go over any areas you've already painted to prevent creating any unwanted texture whilst the paint is still drying. And because we thinned our paint, you'll notice that it hasn't covered very well, which means we'll have to apply multiple thin layers to build up to a strong colour. Just make sure to let each layer fully dry before repeating the process till you're happy with the result. Painting this way also stops us from losing any detail on the model. The other colours we're using in the cockpit area are 56 aluminium and 33 matte black. I use the matte black in places satin black should be used as well, as we can achieve the same finish with the varnish later. When you reach step 9, you'll be asked to apply a decal for the instrument panel. So I'm not going to be going into too much detail about applying decals here, just because I'm going to go into a lot more detail later in the tutorial. Just know that I'm applying this decal in the same way I apply all my decals. You could leave everything just painted like this, but I can't imagine the cockpit of a Spitfire looking so fresh and clean for very long. So let me show you how we can create some dirt and grime. Before we start the process of applying any kind of weathering, we want to protect the paint so we don't ruin any of the hard work we've done. To help protect the paint, we can use a coat of satin varnish, but don't worry, I'll explain the different varnishes shortly. You don't need to thin this down, and it can be applied straight to the model with a brush. Just make sure the brush isn't overloaded and try to apply it in even thin layers. You are going to have to build this up with multiple layers. Just make sure to let each layer fully dry and then repeat the process. The parts are now ready for a weathering wash, and the product I love to use is a clay wash from Flory Models. I like to use this clay wash because it can be removed and manipulated with water, unlike enamel washes which you would need a thinner for, and to be honest, I'm really not a fan of the smell. I'm using the grime wash, and this is easy to use and can be applied without having to worry about being messy. It also works really well with the satin finish, and this is why we use the satin varnish first. When it's dry, it does look really messy, but you can now use a damp cotton bud and remove any excess wash you don't want, as it reactivates with water, allowing you to keep manipulating it even after it's dried. The idea is to leave it sitting in all the recesses and details where dirt and mess is likely to build up over time. You can see using this wash gives you a great natural realistic weathered look really easily. When you're happy with the weathering, we want to protect it as well, again using another coat of varnish. But because we don't really want everything to be so glossy, let's use a matte varnish. And the matte varnish I'm using is water based, which I can thin down and use exactly how I use the acrylic paints. If you're not sure what the difference is between a matte, satin and gloss finish is, let me try to explain it. The obvious difference is how they look. Gloss has a very shiny finish, matte isn't shiny at all, and satin is kind of an in-between the two. This happens because gloss has a very smooth surface reflecting more light. The matte is very rough, which doesn't reflect, but it's a surface things like to soak into, and again satin is the in-between. I know that was a lot to get your head around, but it's important to get to know the basics. And as you build and paint more kits, you'll only get better with practice. You'll even find your own way of doing things. Now all the parts of the cockpit are painted and weathered, let's get it put together. When you're trying to put parts together, you may have fit issues where pegs don't quite fit into holes, or there may be gaps where you don't want them. This could be because of the kit, but a lot of the time it's the layers of paint, varnish and washes we've used. So it's a good idea to scrape away those layers where surfaces come together, so we get as good of a fit as possible, so it doesn't cause issues later. Trust me. You may be familiar with polycement that looks like this and comes with a needle applicator, and this is great for larger surfaces, but let's quickly talk about Tamiya extra thin cement. This is a very popular type of polycement to use, and I'm sure I'd get a lot of comments if I hadn't talked about it in this tutorial. The reason it's so well regarded is because it allows you to glue parts in place that are already in position, and the brush applicator makes this even more straightforward. The glue is so thin it's able to flow into all the recesses and gaps, but evaporate very quickly on an open surface, which means it won't create any problems with any details on your model. With the cockpit finished, we can move on to assembling the rest of the Spitfire and getting it ready for painting. We're now going to go through the process of building and getting the rest of the Spitfire ready for painting. And just so you know, I made sure I painted and weathered the inside of these Spitfire halves at the same time as the cockpit, so we can get straight into building. The cockpit tub is put in place first, and the last part is also put in place, before we close up the two halves. Always make sure to dry fit everything first because we want to be able to fix any issues before things are glued in place. When you're happy everything fits nicely, work your way around the join, only gluing small areas at a time, while you make sure everything is lined up correctly. You can use some tape to hold parts in place while we do this, and whilst the glue dries. When you have the two halves together, let's work on this engine cover. If we did a good job of making sure everything fits up until now, there shouldn't be much of a problem. Just take your time, but if there are some issues like gaps or places not lining up properly once it's glued in place, don't worry because we can sort out any fit issues in a bit. You should now have the Spitfire's body stuck together, so let's move on to building the wing section, and then I can show you how to clean everything up and prepare to get everything painted. So in this kit you do get the option to remove some of the panels on the wing, so you can see inside where the guns would be. If you do decide to do this, just know that it is a big task, and I would only recommend it to those who are already experienced modelers. Also, you need to decide whether to have the landing gear down or raised. I'll be having mine lowered so I can display it on a shelf. It's time to glue the wings together, and to make this as easy as possible, I'll first sand the flat areas of the wings, making sure they're completely flat. There's all kinds of things that could happen to warp or affect these areas, so they no longer fit together the way they should. To stick these larger areas together, I like to use a standard poly cement first, and then use the liquid poly for any areas the other glue didn't stick. Before we glue the wings to the main body, I first want to go around cleaning up any joins and messy areas. My preferred method is using a scraping tool because I can be more precise being careful not to remove any of the details, but do this step using whatever method you prefer. However it's been cleaned up, I always like to finish up with some light sanding. Here's the big moment where we can stick the wings to the Spitfire body. Just do your best to make sure everything is where it needs to be and is lined up. You can use some masking tape to keep the wings in position whilst they dry. I do skip ahead in the instructions because I'm going to attach the underside of the nose. I'll do this now so I can check any joins and fit issues. Now let's first check all our joins to see if there are any small gaps we can't see. And to make this easier, you can just use some primer from the pot, and once it's dried it'll make the gaps more visible. To fill the gaps, I like to use Vallejo's plastic putty. Apply the putty anywhere there are gaps, and to make sure I also like to use a cocktail stick to work it into the gaps. You can use water and a cotton bud to clean away any mess very easily. You may need to repeat the process of filling in the gaps, because when the putty dries it can shrink back, still leaving a gap. To finish cleaning up these areas, I would give them a light sanding as well. We've now done a lot of the big jobs and messy stuff that we've needed to do, so it should now start to feel like we're actually getting somewhere. For this build I want the canopy to be open, so we want to only attach 2 of the parts to the body. And to glue the canopy in place I use some clear fix, which dries clear and doesn't affect the clear plastic. Fix any gaps the same way with some of the putty, and we'll also have to cover the clear areas for when we apply our primer. Humbrol Mascol is a great product for this. It starts as a liquid and soon dries, creating a protective layer which is easily removed when we've finished. It's easy enough to just blob it on and work it into the areas you want it with a cocktail stick, and it really doesn't need to be that neat as long as the important areas are covered. I would also check if anywhere else needs covering up, like the cockpit. Here I've used one of the spare canopies. Our Spitfire is now ready for painting, so let's get everything primed. For any areas missed with the spray, you can just finish up using primer from the pot. With that done, we can move on to getting everything painted. As fun as cleaning up parts and sticking things together is, I do prefer painting, which we're now going to cover in this section. So you may have noticed that I don't use an airbrush in this tutorial. That's because I just prefer to brush paint. And it also gives me the opportunity to show you that you can still get some great results without one. So everything is now ready to be painted, and I won't be going into so much detail this time as I've already done that. So I'll just talk you through the steps as I do them. I'm going to start off painting the camo pattern using the instructions as reference, which shows us what the design should look like. I start off roughly painting in the lines for the pattern, and when I'm happy with it I fill in all the areas that are going to be 30 dark green. You can see I've marked the areas I need to fill, because it is easy enough to zone out and fill in the wrong areas, just like I did. I then paint all the areas that should be 29 dark earth. Don't worry too much about being messy, you are allowed to go back and neaten up the design after. The next big area to paint is the underside of the Spitfire using 90 beige green. This is quite a thin paint, so you may be worried after you apply the first coat. Just remember that it's always better to build up the colour using multiple thin layers until you have a solid colour. With the main body of the Spitfire done, I went ahead and painted everything else. And whilst you're building and painting your models, I want you to just take a moment to enjoy it and not to worry about how it's going to turn out or if you're doing it right. All that comes with practice. For the propeller, you may want to paint the tips first of all with some white, which is going to make painting the 24 trainer yellow much easier, and then paint the rest of it using 33 matte black. You should now have everything painted, which means we can move on to my favourite bit, applying the decals. In this section I'm going to be showing you how decals work and the best way to apply them. Believe me when I say I love applying decals. For me, this is when the kit really starts to come to life and starts looking like what it's meant to be. Decals also allows you to get more detail and interest on your model without having to create it yourself. So let me show you how I apply them. We want to get all the surfaces ready for the decals first, because they work better applied to a glossy surface. This stops any air getting trapped under the decals, causing something called silvering, ruining the finish of the decal. To create this glossy surface, I apply thin layers using gloss varnish all over like we did earlier in the tutorial. It Again, build this up slowly until you have a good coverage. Our Spitfire is now ready for our decals. This is a decal sheet, and decal sheets allow us to add details to our models that will be difficult to paint on. The decals themselves sit on a backing sheet that when wet the decals will separate from. Each decal design is also numbered, and the back of the box or instructions will show you where that particular decal goes. I find it helps to cut up the decal sheet and put all the decals together that are going to be used for each section of the Spitfire. To release the decals from the backing paper, let's dip the decal in some water and then lay this flat while it soaks through. After a couple of minutes, you should be able to slide the decal around on the backing paper, meaning you can now lift it off onto the model. Apply some water to the area you're going to place the decal first, which allows you to slide the transfer around until you're happy it's in position. To help the transfers adhere to the surface shape and details better, we can use some decal fix to soften them. This is just applied using a brush, letting it do its thing. These are pretty thick decals, so it can take some time to do this. After a few minutes, when the decals have softened a bit, you can use a damp cotton bud and roll it over the decal to get rid of any air bubbles and help deform it to any detail. If you feel the decals need to be softened more, just apply some more of the decal fix. Now all the decals are in place, we want to make sure we protect them so they don't get damaged. But let's give the Spitfire a wipe down first with some water to remove any leftover residue or dirt if there is any. To protect the decals, we're going to, you guessed it, apply another layer of varnish. This time it's going to be satin varnish again to help with the next step. It's me again. I know you're probably worried about how many layers we're applying to our model, but don't worry, as long as you're keeping them thin and applying them in the way I've been showing you through this tutorial, you should have no problem. When you've applied the varnish and you've left it to fully dry, we can move on to the final steps to getting our Spitfire finished. In this last part of the tutorial, I'm going to show you how to easily make your models look more interesting and get this Spitfire finished. So we just applied a layer of satin varnish because we're now going to do what we did with the cockpit and apply a wash all over to make our Spitfire more interesting and more real. This time I've chosen to use a dark dirt clay wash. I would put down some paper towel first because this is going to be messy. You don't need to worry about being neat, again just cover everything and make sure to let it completely dry before doing anything with it. It's really up to you how dirty you want it to look and how much of the clay wash you want to remove. Here I'm using a damp paper towel because I want to get most of it off, leaving it just in the panel lines and around details. This really helps bring out all the details, gives it some age and helps it to look more like something that could exist in the real world. I've also done the wash on all the separate parts still waiting to be put together. I'm not going to be going through any of the kind of weathering in this tutorial except for this wash. I just feel this is enough to get you started and we can think about more advanced techniques like weathering later. Now we're done with painting, doing decals, and giving our Spitfire a wash. I take my time assembling and gluing everything in place, and for this you can use either super glue or poly cement. Just know that the poly cement can ruin the paint, so be careful. The last thing I'm going to do is to give the Spitfire a spray coat of matte varnish. This is not only going to help protect all your hard work, it also creates an overall finish rather than having all those different finishes created by the various varnishes and washes. Oh, and one last thing, you can clean up your canopies and clear parts using a cocktail stick to scratch away any paint you don't want there. My goal for this tutorial was to give you the confidence to take a kit from the box, to build it, paint it, apply the decals and make it look more interesting with the wash. Nothing fancy. We weren't building a Spitfire for a competition. So hopefully I've been able to help you get started and build your own kits. And the only thing left to do now is to see how my Spitfire turned out. Our Mark.1 Supermarine Spitfire is now finished, and I hope I've been able to give you the confidence and knowledge to go away and paint some of your own kits. I really enjoy making these tutorials and I hope you find it useful. If you did, you can really help the channel by liking the video and commenting below. Make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss out on future content, and I'll see you in the next video.